from Silvio Oconte, National Fish and Wildlife Refuge, and Jack Minnick, Land Management Coordinator, Vermont Land Trust. And to discuss some terminology, Rachel Klisch is going to speak.
Yeah, so just so everyone knows what we mean when we say invasive species, we mean non-native species that were introduced into a new location, more than likely, most often from a different country, by human activity, either intentionally or by accident. And they are capable of taking over habitats to the detriment of native species. So these non-native invasive species do not have the predators or the disease that they have in their native countries. And when they come into the United States, they take full advantage of not having these predators or diseases to keep them in check. And when we talk about non-chemical management, we are talking about research-based, or those that are management that have been used by other professionals. Excuse me 1 minute. Sorry about that. They're research-based non-herbicide techniques that complement herbicide and or are standalone techniques to manage invasive plants.
And so with that terminology in place, we also want to set some kind of grounding perspectives that we're operating from and that we really recommend others to operate with as they approach invasive plant management. And the first is just that herbicide and non-herbicide techniques often can and do work in concert to better management outcomes. We don't, for this purposes of this webinar, we're not really presenting an either or option. We want to give you non-chemical options, but we don't want to suggest that these are somehow always going to be distinct from the use of herbicide, or that they can't be combined to have more effective management. The second perspective is just basically any management technique must match the species biology and ecology, its location and surrounding natural community, the scale of the infestation, and your own capacity. And this is mainly in your time and your money and your management goals. If one of these isn't matched to the species and the technique, then you are less likely to succeed in successfully managing that species. And finally, different management techniques may involve different timelines for management. A huge part of invasive plant management, if you're doing it as a private landowner, is your own motivation and your own desire to affect successful management over time. And I think a lot of people wish that management always happened in one growing season, and that there was a silver bullet technique to be done with whatever invasive plant problem they have in just a year. But every management technique is likely to have its own unique management timeline that's relative to the infestation location and the plant species. And an example of this is we have Fictional Phil and Knotweed. So Fictional Phil is a young lad on the left of the screen with his fashionable hat, has down below his own patch of knotweed. This is kind of his burden to bear, and he is hopeful to get rid of it so he can start planting some native plants there. But he doesn't really take the time to investigate maybe how knotweed can spread or other successful management techniques, and he sees his trusty weed whacker and says, I'll just use it. And so you'll notice, just imagine in your mind's eye, that this weed whacker is cruising through knotweed and sending tiny little pieces of knotweed everywhere, which you can see below, little resprouts from fragments. And maybe Fictional Phil didn't know that knotweed resprouts really well from being shredded and tossed around. And before fictional fill knows it, there's already little pieces of knotweed that have grown into new plants across the fence in his neighbor's yard. And quickly, young fictional fill transitions to kind of this older fictional fill, which looks a little more weary of dealing with knotweed. And this is just an example of trying to of making sure you take the time to match whatever technique you are going to use to the biology of that plant, which is a theme that will pop up consistently throughout this presentation. So the first methods that we're going to talk about are pretty much the simplest and maybe some of the oldest, and that's hand pulling or weed wrenching, and hand cutting. And so a quick description of these: this basically stops the plant's ability to photosynthesize and store nutrients and reproduce, ideally, using hand tools like a weed wrench, which you can see in the picture in the top right corner, or using loppers or shears or some other cutting implement. And you can see in the lower picture, the person is carrying a pair of loppers. And using those tools, including your hands, to remove part of the plant, or ideally as much of the plant as you can, including the above ground and below ground mass. Obviously with the loppers, you're probably just removing the above ground portion of the plant. And some pros for this method, or for these methods: it immediately makes more light and resources available to neighboring native plants. If you are wrenching out large shrubs, even though it's pretty likely that they'll probably resprout, it makes future management a lot easier to see, considering you don't have this large shrubby bush taking up a lot of visual space. And both methods are just generally really simple to execute and to implement. There are, however, cons, just like with any technique. Pulling and wrenching really disturbs the soil, and that disturbing the soil as well as making that greater light availability, typically, especially if the invasive plant had time to set seed, will mean that those invasive plant seeds will pop, and you'll have new invasive plants taking that individual's place, or you'll have resprouts if you weren't able to get all of the root out, which is quite a difficult challenge. Some species, like fictional fill found out, resprout really well from root fragments, like knotweed, or when they have their above ground mass disturbed, they resprout really well from nodes along their root network, and that is classically exemplified by Asiatic bittersweet. Some other cons of these: they're very labor intensive, and they're pretty impractical for really large, intense infestations. And that can be kind of relative to your site conditions, but any really, really expansive infestation is going to be pretty hard to manage by hands. And I can't see what I wrote down there, but there's just a significant likelihood that resprouts will happen, whether you're cutting or whether you're pulling out by hand or using a weed wrench. It's almost very likely that, or it's almost certain that resprouting will happen. Next slide, please, Corey. Some timing and conditions for these. This obviously varies a little bit per species, but ideally this is happening when plants are really young, so that they don't have really large developed root networks that make it harder to pull the plant out, and also make it more likely that you will break off roots as you try and pull them out. So you want those plants young with smaller root networks, and this is best done, and this is for hand pulling, best done when the conditions are pretty wet and when the soil is a little loose. And as far as effectiveness, it can be effective on small infestations and seedlings. You've got glossy buckthorn seedlings in the photo to the right. This could be its own webinar, but proper disposal of invasive plant material is pretty important, especially when doing something like hand pulling, where you're removing part of the roots out, because if those plants are allowed to make contact with soil, especially wet soil, it's pretty likely that they will be able to resprout and continue living. Next slide, please. So this is a lot of text, but I'll quickly point out some patterns that you'll notice. For hand pulling and wrenching, This works really well for a lot of the woody shrub species like glossy buckthorn, common buckthorn, autumn olive, burning bush, Norway maple, and so on. These plants are best pulled when they're young, and ideally with smaller diameters. A smaller diameter generally will mean a smaller root network, so a little bit easier to pull out. And ideally you want to do this before they flower, just so that any plant material that you pull out doesn't have time to set seed and spread that seed as you ideally deal with the plant on site. But if you do take it off site, that's less likely to spread the seed off site. For the cutting technique, you'll notice pretty similar trends with woody shrub species. Can include multiflora rose and Asiatic bittersweet. Ideally, this cutting technique, so just you're cutting it off at the base, this is happening pre-flowering. And if you are just employing cutting, which you do see sometimes, people will attempt to just purely cut a plant over and over the course of growing season, just know that the timeline for this technique to be effective is quite long and can stretch into many years. So hand pulling with extreme caution is black swallowwort, Asiatic bittersweet, and goutweed. These plants, I say you can hand pull them with extreme caution because they are very good at resprouting, and any hand pulling that you do with them must remove a majority of the root network, or else you will quickly find yourself with more of these plants. So really you're just pulling them at the seedling stage, and you will be, if you're doing this appropriately, removing as much of the root network as you possibly can. Really important, if you ever do hand pull black swallowwort or Asiatic bittersweet or goutweed, make sure to flag where you've pulled this so that you can readily come back and check for resprouts, because it is very likely that they will. And this technique isn't advised if there are lots and lots of individuals or if they're really mature plants, just because the resprouting will be that much heavier. And then I think it's on to Chris.
Yeah, hi everyone. My name is Chris. I'm going to be talking primarily today about grazing and browsing with ruminant species. So just to get us started, goats browse, which is to say they eat primarily woody species, broadleaf trees and things, and sheep are grazers, which means they primarily eat grasses and herbaceous plants. Both of these different species of animals can be used to remove or at least reduce the quantity of invasives on a given site. And sometimes it's not even necessarily invasives. At my own house, I have been utilizing the goats you see behind me to even get rid of beech stump sprouts and things. So the timing and conditions, really up here in Vermont, it's anytime during the growing season. This is roughly the end of April. I usually start seeing barberry leafing out and some of the buckthorn. All the way up until I'm just starting to see sort of the last of the buckthorn leaves falling at this point, and my goats are still munching those right up. I'm gonna just quickly pause to say that everything I'm talking about with goats is based on personal experience, like over the last 3 years of managing goats on my property and within my neighborhood, and research that I've done. And I'll talk about the research in just a moment. So effectiveness is very similar to what Jack was just talking about with hand pulling and cutting. And here timing is key. Thinking about the process by which the plant grows, obviously we're going to want to cut things off, or rather defoliate, before they have a chance to set seed, which is usually in late summer. And invasive plants tend to be really good at throwing out another set of leaves as soon as they're defoliated. It's on average, this photo in the far corner, there's a before and after there. In the corner is the before. In the center is the after. Unfortunately, I didn't think to take this picture right at the moment when I took the goats out of there. But this is actually a combination of two things. The goats defoliated, and then we did a lot of weed wrenching and cutting in here as well. So I'm expecting to see a lot of sprouts next year. So we'll put the goats back in there. But, you know, apart from the change in season, we had essentially a wall of common and glossy buckthorn and bittersweet and things, and now we have opened back up to just the native trees. And then in the other corner with the goats, that's really just a sea of bittersweet and things that I've put my goats on 3 times now. And at this point, I'm just seeing bittersweet seedlings coming back up and occasional buckthorn stump sprouting. Next slide, please. So the pros of the goats is that they're doing a lot of physical labor that Jack mentioned earlier. They're taking care of a good deal of it. And in places where you do have native species or other plants that you're trying to favor, you're immediately making more light and resources available to them. The other thing that's happening when you're browsing animals on the vegetation is that you're essentially robbing the plants of their ability to photosynthesize. So as they're photosynthesizing, invasive plants tend to store a lot of energy in their roots. So when they are defoliated, they then draw on that energy, throw out a new set of leaves, and go right back to storing more energy. But you're depleting that every time you browse. So in the case of cattle, for instance, you want to rotate them frequently because you're having a detrimental effect on the grass. But here, we are intentionally having a detrimental effect on the plants. And just some other things that we're starting to see a little bit more interest in as our conversations and understanding of climate change are getting a little more robust and informed. Something that's happening here that has a lot of potential is that when you're defoliating, there's a proportion of root mass that's then being shed and dying underneath the soil, which is essentially carbon that's being sequestered from the atmosphere. And simultaneously, you're immediately returning all of those nutrients that were being monopolized by the invasive plant and putting them right back on the ground in a very quickly disintegrating form for other plants to accumulate. So I'm going to transition into talking about some of the cons now, because there are definitely some downsides here. As you can see, the before picture, this is essentially just a shrub of bittersweet. I don't know what was under here when we bought the house, but it completely killed whatever was underneath the bittersweet and just made this sort of ball of vines. And in the lower photo, you can see that the goats, they got to browse height and then they called it a day. So there was a lot of hand cutting to get that top layer down to where they could reach it. Next slide, please. So the big con with goats is they do not have a sense of what's important to keep and what is important to let go. So here we have my goat, Lainey. She girdled this, one of the nicest like pine saplings that I had. And you can see over the picture of her face, she's not really feeling guilty about it. And she's got a bunch of pine sap all over her mouth. So I know it was her, and dirt. one of the cons of using a grazing method is like any of these mechanical methods or non-herbicide methods we're talking about, they really need to be consistently and repeatedly applied. Generally, we're going to want to combine this with cutting as well. Timing is key. We certainly don't want to delude ourselves into thinking that we're eliminating the problem if we're just letting the plants go to seed. And then fencing can sometimes be difficult. So yeah, those are sort of the cons. And quickly, Peter asked, how do you keep the goats from browsing natives? Generally, you can fence the native species that you want to protect out, but if they're really intermixed with the invasives, you're going to have to take some sort of loss and just accept that that's going to be the case, or you can put individual cages around trees. And goats will browse barberry. They tend to do it only in the fall and the spring. I'm not sure why that is. The last thing I was going to say about research is the research that I've done on goats reminded me how little, I guess I should say research in quotes, how little accurate and really scientific information there is out there. So, you know, I've heard a lot of sort of home recipes for non-chemical management of invasive plants, and you know, one of them involves like spraying vinegar and things as a defoliation method. I don't recommend things like that. What we're presenting here today is really research based and has proven to be effective. I don't recommend spraying things on plants if you don't know what you're doing, and if there's no sort of scientific approach to doing it. So with that, I think that concludes the grazing section. Yes, so plants best suited for this, really anything that's woody and leafy. They will just go right for it. Rose and barberry, goats especially, and lambs to a slightly lesser degree, have very, they're really able to just pull leaves right off the stem and avoid thorns, although sometimes I've just seen them eat entire branches as well, and it doesn't seem to bother them. And so far, just because there are seeds I'm seeing on all of these, so far I have put my goats on plants that are seeding, and I have not seen any seeds come up after they've been passed through the goats, but I will keep an eye on that. And I think that's it now. Thank you.
So our next method that we're going to talk about is mowing, mulching, and brush hogging. And when we're talking about this method, we're including weed whacking, using a lawnmower, a brush mower, and tractors or skid steers that have special attachments to them. And our goal is to remove portions of the plant that's above the soil to deplete the root reserves. And the best time to mow is just before or just as the plants are flowering. And the reason why is because plants take a lot of energy to produce flowers, and you want to hit the plants just as they're utilizing most of their reserves and their roots. But you want to do so, you want to mow before the plants begin putting nutrients back into their roots. And this happens during the flowering stage. You will likely have to mow several times during the growing season. Some plants will put up additional stems and sprouts to start to flower and try to put out seeds. So you want to make sure that you're monitoring your site. And you definitely do not want to mow if the plant has set seed, because you're only going to spread that plant. In my experience from mowing, mowing will minimize the spread of shrubs, but it will not remove the shrubs from the site. Shrubs have a very large root system, and so it takes a lot more than just mowing to remove them. They tend to root sprout, and it will take a really long time to mow a shrub so that it is removed from the area. So I found that you'll have increased effectiveness if you combine it with other methods, such as chemical treatment. So you would mow and then apply chemicals, and that has a higher effectiveness than just mowing shrubs. Another way to increase the effectiveness of mowing is to leave trimmings and fall leaves on the ground to build up the soil, which will help suppress the existing seed bank. And also, if you mow above or around desired plants and allow them to flower and produce seed, or you go ahead and put some seed down, such as clover, and allow that to grow, which is low growing, and that will provide competition for the invasive that you're trying to manage. Next slide, Corey. So some pros for mowing is it's generally fast, especially if you're utilizing large machinery, and you end up with a relatively finished appearance. It will reduce the seed production if you mow at the right time. And any biomass, such as if you leave the clippings or the leaves on the ground, it will provide nutrients to your soil because it will break down. And then hypothetically, there's a higher potential for the invasive plant seeds to be buried and making germination more difficult. So those are the pros for mowing. First, the cons for mowing, if you have large infestations, you will likely need to utilize some specialized equipment, such as a skid steer with a mulcher attached, and these are much more expensive. These machines also tend to be on tracks, or even if you're using a tractor, they will create some soil disturbance and have potential to move seeds and seedlings. And so you have more potential to spread. And mowing is definitely not suitable for invasive plants that spread by rhizome or by nodes. As Jack mentioned with Phil, it will spread knotweed, because knotweed spreads by rhizome, and if you're mowing it, it's going to spread the plants. So mowing is definitely not appropriate for managing knotweed. Next slide. So this is an example of an area that's about 3 acres in size, and a skid steer with a mulcher attached was used to mulch buckthorn, and it took the skid steer about 6 hours to do this site. And this is a before and after photo of this site. Next slide. So these are just some plants that might be suited for mowing, and these are all shrubs. So as I mentioned, it's best to mow these just before or just as they're starting to flower. And as I mentioned again, that if you wish to have to be more effective at mowing, then you should use this mowing with other treatment methods. Next slide. And here are some herbaceous plants that are suited for this method for mowing. That includes spotted knotweed, garlic mustard, stiltgrass, I put wild parsnip in here because I have seen wild parsnip controlled through mowing, but I also put a caution here because, as many of you may know, wild parsnip does have a sap, and if the sap gets on your skin and the sun touches your skin, it will create blisters. So I just wanted to throw a caution out there. If you're going to mow this, then I would advise that you wear long pants and long sleeve shirt. These other plants, the spotted knotweed, garlic mustard, and silkgrass, you can also weed whack if they're small infestations. I don't think I'd weed whack wild parsnip. And be aware of when these species flower. For instance, garlic mustard flowers in the spring, and Japanese silkgrass is flowers in the fall. So you want to time your mowing as to when they begin, before or just as they're starting to flower. You will likely have to do repeated annual mowings to deplete the seed bank, because there will be seeds in the soil and they will just resprout every year. Next slide. Another method we're calling tarping or smothering. And this method, you lay down layers of cardboard, black and white newspaper. I do not recommend laying down colored newspaper because the ink does have chemicals in it and that will get into your soils. So you lay down these layers of cardboard and newspaper, and as you're laying down these layers, you saturate each layer with water. And then you add mulch on top of that. And you want to make sure that you're buffering your infestation beyond the infestation at least 2 feet, because you want to make sure that you're covering any area that might have additional seed source that you weren't aware of, or if you're trying to manage an invasive that throws out runners or rhizomes of some sort. So it's a good idea to buffer about 2 feet. And what you're trying to do here is you're trying to kill the plant by so that it's not getting sunlight and oxygen. Essentially, you're saturating the soil to remove the oxygen from the area, and that helps to kill the plant. You can use tarps or plastic, but I'm not recommending that you do that because we're trying to minimize the amount of plastic that's in the environment. Plus, plastic can get very brittle quite quickly. And all that work that you did, you're gonna see your plants start to come through if you use plastic over time. If you wish to minimize the amount of time that you're trying to apply this method, I would suggest applying it during the seedling stage. Otherwise, you're gonna have to remove all undesirable vegetation. You're gonna cut the stems back, weed whack or mow, and then put your smothering material down. And you're gonna leave it in place for several seasons. I've read 6 months, but I would consider a few years just to make sure that you're smothering the plant. But maybe not a few years, at least a year. And then you're gonna wanna monitor the site for any holes or tears. And this is most effective on small infestations of non-woody herbaceous plants. It would take a very long time to try and smother a woody plant. And to increase the effectiveness of this method, planting native species on top or within the smothering material after you've smothered the plants provides additional competition to the plants that you're trying to smother with the underground roots. And then if for any reason you decide to remove the smothering material, just be aware that you may still have a seed bank and that you may still see sprouts coming in. And so you need to monitor the site. Next slide. So the pro for this method is the ease of application. You essentially lay it down and you leave it. And like I said, I think a pro is that you can plant native species within the smothering material, or you can allow native plants to establish on their own. And they'll do very well because they don't have the competition from other plants. A con is that it's not feasible for large infestations. It would take a lot of cardboard and newspaper for very large infestations. So I consider that a con. And you also won't be able to use the space while the material is in place, because you don't want to put holes in the material. You just want to leave it alone until it's done doing its thing. Next slide. So here's some examples of some plants that are suited for this method. Goutweed, garlic mustard, black swallowwort, and wild parsnip. I feel like this is a really good option for wild parsnip. I've not had experience trying to smother wild parsnip, but you would only have to handle the plant once, since you would remove the plant, or you'd put the smothering material down when it's a seedling, and you may not have to handle the plant at all. And then you leave it there, and hopefully it smothers the plant, and then you don't have to handle the plant as much. And I put Japanese knotweed on here, though I have mixed feelings with Japanese knotweed based on my experience. Can you go to the next slide, Corey? So we have Japanese knotweed. We have one site on the refuge, and it's in an old, called a stump dump. It's where stumps used to be dumped before we owned the land. And Japanese knotweed is growing there. And before I arrived, the biologist decided to try and smother this plant using plastic. And they cut the plant down, as you can see in the photo with the kids are cutting the knotweed down, and they're laying down the plastic. But after a few years, the knotweed started to poke through the plastic. And you can see in the upper right-hand corner, the photo where there's black plastic and you can see knotweed is coming in. Plus we had knotweed trying to come up on the edges. And so when I arrived, I saw that this was not working. And so I took the plastic off. This was like 3 years after the plastic was laid. And the knotweed came back with a vengeance, as you can see in the bottom left photo. And so I took all the plastic off as much as I could. It was starting to deteriorate, so it was really hard to get up. And then I sprayed it with herbicide. And it's been about 10 years or so. And so far, and I have all native plants now growing in this site. I have a lot of milkweed, and I have a lot of goldenrod. And I do have an occasional knotweed that still comes up, and I just spot treat that. So maybe if this was done a little differently, maybe if there was a much bigger buffer, and maybe if we used cardboard or newspaper with mulch, I might have had a different experience. But this is what I've experienced with knotweed. And I think that's all I have, Corey.
All right. So I'm going to talk about flame weeding pretty briefly, mostly because it only really applies to seedlings. This is like literal seedlings. Seed sprouts, puts up to the first leaves, and this is the stage that we're looking to hit these. We're not talking about stump sprouts, which are a little different. They are new leaves off of an already established root system. So flame weeding uses a tremendous amount of heat passed really briefly over the leaf surface to essentially burst the cells in the leaf, which destroys the plant's ability to create food, and the seedling dies. The pro here is there is no soil disturbance, and I didn't write this out, but generally you can be really targeted with this method. The cons, thinking about the weather that we've had this year in the Northeast, it is potentially very dangerous in terms of the user burning themselves and in terms of the possibility of starting fires. Whenever I've done flame weeding before, it's usually in the rain or just after rain when the ground is saturated. And also one of the cons is the equipment is rather cumbersome. I'll talk about that in a moment on the next slide. But the timing is really, it has to be the seedling stage. If you wait too long and a root system establishes, then you're essentially just defoliating. And if there's any stored energy in there, the plant will be able to create new leaves. So the effectiveness is it's better control on broadleaf plants. I mean, grasses are essentially, they have evolved to repeatedly replace their top growth. And the repeated use can be difficult. Next slide, please. Well, it can also use a tremendous amount of propane. So the photo on the right is the mechanism I'm talking about here. It's a long stick with a bell at the end, and near that red handle, there's like sort of a trigger thing, and there's always a flame going lightly, but when you pull the trigger, it really lets propane flow. So yeah, you just pass that over the plants. Of course, this is also a 25-pound propane cylinder, which is no fun to carry through the woods, especially with that length of hose. I have seen people rig these up before on frame backpacks, which can work pretty well. And over on the left photo, that is later in the year, the same area that I had the goats in from before. So this is just, I call this a carpet of bittersweet. All of those are bittersweet seedlings. So one of the other cons of this method is you have to be really good at identifying seedlings, which is sometimes not a skill that everyone has. And frequently, seedlings look quite a bit different than mature plants. So the plants best suited for this, buckthorn, bittersweet, garlic, mustard, and burning bush. It sounds like the jury's still out on honeysuckle and barberry, and I don't have any personal experience trying to treat those with flame weeding, but I have seen that it's very effective for these bittersweet carpets. And that's it for flame weeding.
Great. Thanks, Chris, Jack, and Rachel. We wanted to make you aware of some identification resources and information about removal options that are out there. If you go to vtinvasives.org and then you find the species that you're interested in, there's all kinds of information on there about removal. In fact, if you pull up the management options tag or tab, you'll see this page, and it gives you all the information you might want to know about both manual removal options and chemical removal options and timing on those plants. And then also Go Botany is a great site. And then the third one here is a link to some YouTube videos that members of the SISMA filmed on a property in Brattleboro that VLT owns, just showing how to identify some of the common woodland invasives. And all of those links are available on the Conservation District webpage if you're looking for them. We have 2 more upcoming webinars we want to tell you about before we get to the question and answer. November 11th, Should I Spray? Responsible Herbicide Use in the Control of Invasive Plants. And December 9th, Early Detection Species. Information on how to register for those is up on the website. And then finally, we would love to hear your feedback on what you thought of this webinar. And if you have suggestions for future programming, future outreach events, all that, we'd really like to hear back from folks as to what they want out of this SISMA. I will momentarily post the link to the feedback survey in the chat box. I'll do it now, and then I'll do it at the end of the Q&A, and I'll also email it out so everyone has it. So what questions do folks have? It looks like we have quite a few in the chat.
One that we had early on was about timing mowing for nesting birds. Anybody want to tackle that?
Probably August to be safe. Even though a lot of birds are done in June, they don't necessarily entirely leave the location, and juveniles don't fly that well. So if you shoot for August, you're usually pretty safe.
I would agree with that, Corey.
And the state of Vermont has put out some information on delayed mowing practices for nesting birds. So if you punch that into Google, it'll come up with some good state websites.
Okay, question from Kimberly, will your goats browse barberry?
Yes, the goats really like barberry. Largely in the spring, I think it's because it's one of the first things to leaf out, and then again later in the fall. But they seem to prefer almost anything else in the summer.
Great. Is there a particular breed of goat that is best?
No, not that I'm aware of. I know in terms of sheep, a lot of people prefer a hair sheep for this particular application because you don't have to worry about harvesting their wool, and their wool tends to be degraded pretty substantially by going into areas that are filled with a lot of different invasive or opportunistic plants. But I personally raise Saanens and Nigerian dwarf goats right now. The Saanens escape fairly readily, or they have, because they're tall enough, and the Nigerian dwarfs are just sort of little bullies. They all sort of have a little Napoleon complex. But otherwise, I found them to be perfectly lovely.
A question from John for Chris. Did you state that browsing/grazing leaves a root mass underground that is sequestering carbon and releasing nutrients into the soil?
Yeah, I wanted to clarify that. So it's the manure that the goats are depositing that is providing the nutrients more immediately to the other plants because it's being broken down by soil microbes into readily usable nutrients, whereas the carbon sequestration would be coming from the the carbonaceous material that the plants are shedding in response to being defoliated and essentially shrinking in structure.
Question from Melissa. Do you have to train the goats to eat invasives?
Nope, they just eat. That's no training required. The only training is getting them accustomed to respecting the electronet fence. And that so far has worked pretty easily. It only takes a couple shocks on the nose for them to figure out that they should just stay where I put them.
Question from Ricky. Is now a good time to do any heavy duty mowing? Anyone have any thoughts about that?
I would say as long as you know what you're mowing. It's getting to the season where twig identification is sort of the thing you need to have down. But yeah, I think now is a great time to mow.
Yeah, and I would also make sure that it's not seeding right now, which a lot of things are starting to seed. But you can do dormant mows. You can mow when the species are dormant, and that's perfectly fine.
Looks like we have a couple of questions about knotweed. Somebody asks about what to do for riverside infestations in terms of the best option, and also a question about the use of hardware cloth to deal with knotweed non-chemically.
I can speak from experience with the hardware cloth, and it sounds like someone else in the chat has some experience too. Jack chime in too. I'd be interested to hear your opinion as well. VLT set up a hardware cloth demonstration site, which you are all welcome to come out and visit if you want to look at a patch of kind of healthy knotweed. I think in an ideal world, the plants send up shoots, and they're girdled as they put on lateral growth, and that girdling causes them to die back, and then they constantly do it again and again in a growing season, and they eventually exhaust their reserves. But unfortunately, from the patent that we built ours off of, it did not really work. They were still quite vigorous plants despite having a pretty narrow diameter. So we don't really think it was that effective in preventing the plant from being able to photosynthesize and keep sending nutrients back down.
That was exactly my experience. The largest and earliest stems did get girdled and fell over, but they kept on putting up new shoots, and I cut them all down before they flowered, but I think if I had relied on the hardware cloth completely, they would have flowered and set seed. So I'm on to plan D or plan E. I don't know what it is yet, but.
Sally had a question. Rachel, what herbicide did you use on the knotweed when the tarping didn't work, and how large was the area?
The area was probably about a 1/4 acre, and I simply used rodeo Roundup, no glyphosate. I will say that there's other mixtures that are more effective than just glyphosate. I feel like glyphosate doesn't have the percent control that other mixtures might have. Like maybe using Milestone or something like that. I'd have to get back to you with the exact mixture that I have found that works really well, that others have used. So that's what I used, and it took a few years to get it to the point where I was spot treating. Chris, I actually have a question for you about knotweed. Do you know if goats will eat knotweed?
You know, I don't have any personal experience with it, but I have heard that they do.
Okay.
Yes. They're not the tidiest eaters. It looks like Gloria raised her hand. Maybe she can chime in.
Gloria, you're muted.
Down in the lower left. There you go.
Okay. Am I unmuted now?
Yes.
Yes.
Oh,
Yeah.
good. Yeah, I have several articles, and they were, I think, experiments done in Massachusetts, not experiments, but with goats actually, really keeping the knotweed down. So they do eat, and they like it, and they, it's some park in some city, and anyway, I could probably get the references and send those back to you so you could send those out. But definitely goats with knotweed is a good idea. I'm really still very, very curious. Most of the knotweed that I'm encountering here, I'm in Newfane, and all along, and I'm with the Southeastern Vermont Watershed Alliance. And we have incredible patches of knotweed from the Williams River down to the Whetstone Brook in Brattleboro. So when I hear these, if you've got a small patch and if you've got a small patch and, but we have huge patches, and we can't put an herbicide on riverbanks, and they're destroying, Tropical Storm Irene really put down knotweed and distributed it very, very nicely. And so they're just huge patches. And I know that I'm working with the road crew for Newfane, and I'm working with road foreman right now to try to get some money put into the budget. He has a single sickle, I guess that's the name of it, mower. So earlier in the summer, maybe in June, maybe early July, he cut down because it's endangering. We have it on curves, and so it's a traffic hazard. So he cut that down, and another person and I gathered up everything, and I brought it to my place. I'll never do that again. And we dried it and burning it. But there, you know, it really did pull it down. And then if he had done it again, that would have kept it. What he did not flower. But again, it's huge patches, and we have it along Route 30, and the state decided this year because of COVID that they wouldn't do their roadside mowing. And when they do their roadside mowing, they just spread it along because they don't keep the, you know, clean off their blades. So I'm really interested in how we control these huge patches. Okay, I thought you were going to come up with answers.
The only way that I can think for you to do that is by spraying herbicide. When you have large patches like that, and there are herbicides you can use near water.
Okay.
That a lot of people don't want to hear that, but you can treat knotweed using herbicides along your water. And I think that's the best way to get that patch down as much as you can. And then you can use other non-chemical management methods.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's the best way to manage something like that. That's my opinion.
And Rachel, do you have any concept of how expensive something like that would be? I mean, we have miles of it that are 20, 30 feet wide along patches along the rivers.
I won't be able to tell you exactly how much. I mean, you know, up here in the Northeast Kingdom where I am, we don't have those really large, you know, extensive patches like you're talking about. And, you know, we've treated some patches and it's cost us like, you know, like $2,000.
For a small patch.
For the small patches. So I think you're going to have to contact someone who does that professionally and get quotes. I would get different quotes.
Mm-hmm.
See how much it's going to cost you.
And do we need to go through the particular towns? I remember going to the Watersheds United Vermont, and there was one community that wanted to use herbicides, and I mean, they got just lambasted by the residents of the town.
Mm.
And I can't remember which town that was.
It may depend on the different towns, but I know, you know, you go through a specific contractor and they are required, they usually will do the permitting process for you. So you don't have to do the permitting process, but I would ask them about that.
Okay.
They'll do the permits for you. That's required.
Mm-hmm.
So it is after 8 o'clock, and I think our presenters are willing to stick around and continue to answer questions, but just in case anyone's going to leave, I did want to share the link to the feedback survey one more time, as well as the link to the registration page for the future webinars, and those are both in the chat box now.
And you'll send it out by email, right?
I will as well, yes.
Thanks.
It looks like lots of questions about knotweed.
Mm-hmm.
It's a bad one.
Yes. Once mature plants are gone, either chemically or mechanically, is there a good way to deal with the seed bank to prevent all of the sprouting?
What do you mean by seed bank?
This is a question from Mary.
Yeah. Knotweed really spreads by rhizomes.
Yes. Yeah.
That may not have been about knotweed.
Okay.
That may have been general.
I know that there is a I'm going back to herbicides here, and I don't know how to, I wouldn't know anything. I don't know what you would do non-chemically to treat the seed bank. I know there's pre-emergence, which is a chemical, but I don't know otherwise.
Knotweed produces a whole lot of very small seeds. So I doubt very much that there's a very long-lived seed bank for knotweed. That's not true for buckthorn or bittersweet, stuff like that. But as you say, the reproduction is primarily by rhizomes and root shoots.
I see Mary saying buckthorn, bittersweet, etc., but not knotweed. So, and we can.
I'm inclined to say I don't know actually what depth buckthorn, bittersweet, things like that germinate, but I think borrowing Rachel's mulching method, just burying those seeds deep enough that they can't get to the surface is a good method, or just really being attentive, I think, and repeated treatments of whatever course you're taking.
Once the large ones are gone, if you spend 10 or 15 hours walking around pulling seedlings, you can get a handle on it in 3 or 4 years. At least that's my experience on my 40 acres.
Question from Michael. I've had success cutting 1-inch saplings, brush, and even small trees, then painting the stump with glyphosate. Is this acceptable from an environmental standpoint? One of you wants to take that.
It is. There are, I mean, it is within the labeled use of glyphosate, so it is legal. And there's a lot of information flowing in both directions about what glyphosate does and doesn't do. I'm going to clarify right here, I'm a licensed herbicide applicator in Vermont. And I do that. So I have found stump treatment like that to be particularly effective in riparian areas. But it is legal, it is effective. As to its long-term environmental effects, we don't know yet, but glyphosate does readily bind or is readily sort of denatured in the soil. And so far as we are aware, glyphosate has never been found in groundwater or contaminating water in Vermont, nor anywhere for that matter.
Thanks, Chris. A question from Joanne. I want to clear out an area of knotweed that is now browned and dry. Can knotweed resprout from the browned plant material? How should I dispose of the material in the fall?
I don't think it can sprout from the brown material. If the plant's dead, then I think you should be okay. And if you're able to, I think I'd burn it. If it's already dead and dry, you can always burn it and then be done with it. It's my recommendation.
But it will sprout from the roots.
Right. If you go ahead.
Yeah, just another way is that if you have it up on pallets, for example, and you let it just dry, I know Mike Bald, who does a lot of work with the Japanese knotweed through gut weeds, that he said that can then just be composted. You will never, ever put anything that's green or alive or the rhizomes in a compost pile. But once all of those leaves and those stalks are done, it becomes good composting material. But make sure it's dry.
Question from Ingrid, if you pull buckthorn now, will it survive till spring to regrow?
In my experience, yeah, buckthorn's gonna stump sprout. Like I sort of count on it. That's been my experience at a number of sites that I've worked and returned to repeatedly. But it's going to be a lot easier to deal with later. So generally, I would encourage folks to, like, doing something is better than doing nothing at all. Just because it's not the optimal, maybe, way of going about something doesn't mean you shouldn't try it or start.
I actually meant the plant that you pull out. If you just stack it in the woods, will it then regrow in the spring?
No, once the roots dry out, it's not going to resprout. One tactic that I use if I don't have my usual tools or herbicide or anything with me, if I find something that I can yank out of the ground, I usually just put it in the crotch of a tree, upside down, so that the roots aren't making contact with the ground.
I have a lot of buckthorn. It'd be everywhere.
Question from Stuart, in its home range, what was knotweed's natural control? Does anyone know?
There were several beetles that would eat it. And I think that there is some research going on as to whether they are so specific that they could be used as biocontrol. But that's years away.
Yeah.
They have to make sure it won't eat anything native.
More questions about knotweed. If I have a relatively small knotweed infestation, is pulling and or cutting repeatedly considered a pretty good method to get rid of it?
If you got 20 years.
So I'll wait in. And Sage has been asking too. Sage has thrown in a couple questions that I think are relevant to this one. She also asked what's like kind of best practices for just cutting knotweed repeatedly. And as Jack alluded to, if you are cutting knotweed, be prepared. If that's your sole method for addressing it, be prepared to be like very active with that plant for a very long time. I think best practices, if you're just going to cut it, is probably cut it as low to the ground as possible. And you're probably looking at 2 to 3 cuts per month at a minimum for probably 3 to 5 years if it's established at least. That's kind of like the few people that have waded into that method seem to be their timeline, and they're still doing it years and years later. There's Mad River trails in our area. Yeah, Sage, it's a real thing. If you really just want to cut it, you're going to be, you'll get to know that lopper really well. And I think Rachel there was a cutting trial done on Silvio Conti. Does that ring any bells?
Yeah, the only thing that I've done is the smothering, where you cut and you smother, which might be an option. Just make sure you buffer it as much as possible and keep an eye on it. And then I've used cut stem methods with herbicide, and I've also used and I've injected it with herbicide. I've done different things trying to figure out how to manage it, and for me it's been using herbicide. Unfortunately, that's how I've been able to manage it, is using herbicide. So
Rachel, how did the injection method work for you?
it works really well for the large stems. If they're fairly large, then you can get the injection tool in. Otherwise, if they're really small, they split the stem and it doesn't work very well. So it works well on large patches, large established patches.
Now, what I tried was I just bought a turkey basting syringe at Price Chopper,
Yep.
but it wasn't strong enough to get into the larger, woodier stems. The needle came off, and I spread glyphosate everywhere, and I didn't try it anymore. That's when I switched over to the hardware cloth method, which also didn't work all that well. So I guess my question is, where can I get a good beefy syringe that might work?
JK injection is what I used.
JK injections.
Yeah.
When doing the injecting method with Knotweed, did either of you have any exciting run-ins with wasps at all?
Oh, no.
The times that I've tried to do that, wading into Knotweed, I've been stung quite a bit by wasps.
Oh, no.
I fortunately have a small patch, and I could actually afford enough hardware cloth to cover it. That's the other drawback of hardware cloth. It's $20 a roll for, I forget, 45 feet by 3 feet. So if you've got a big infestation, you're into the thousands of bucks. Plus, it's a lot of effort.
So I just want to mention one more. I know we're talking about herbicides, unfortunately, but along those lines, I have cut the stem of knotweed, and then I've had a sponge with a hollow stem on it, and then I was able to utilize the sponge as well as a treatment method on a cut stem.
I'd like to put in a plug here for a company, I think they're in Minnesota or Wisconsin, called Landscape Restoration. They make a tool called a buckthorn blaster, which is exactly what you're talking about, Rachel. It's a container with a sponge on top, just kind of like when we were kids, we used to lick stamps with something like that. But they're only about $8, I think. If you Google buckthorn blaster, I've started buying them by the half a dozen to give to people.
They're
And
really effective.
I love it for cut stump applications.
Yeah, that's what I use at work when I'm doing cut stump work.
Yeah, and I only do it on my own land because I'm not certified.
If you come up with questions after this webinar has ended that you want to ask this panel, you can email us. The SYSMA has a Gmail address, and I just put that in the chat box. It's sevtsysma@gmail.com, and the group's also on Facebook at sevt.sysma.3. Do we have any more questions tonight?
It's not really a question so much as a statement. I was looking into the buckthorn for a friend of mine, and I went online, and I think it's the University of Wisconsin has developed these black plastic bags. So on the large buckthorn, what it does is you cut it so there's about 6 inches of the stump left, and you put these black bags over it, and you have one of the plastic ties on it, and it keeps any other growth from coming up. And has anybody tried those? I only have about 150 of them here because my friend sold his property and is not using them. But has anybody tried those? They're very specifically.
This gets at I think Marie's question earlier. Can you use cans or other devices to smother buckthorn or the woody shrubs? I've not tried them. We have a bunch at VLT that we're going to be trying to demonstrate with to test their effectiveness at a property in West Brattleboro. So if you're curious to see how effective they may be, look for more information on that through the Conservation District website. And Chris and Rachel or others, I don't know, what's been your experience with using that method?
I've found that common buckthorn will tend to resprout from anywhere along its root structure. So not just the former stem, but common buckthorn is really creative, I think is the polite word to use.
And I have glossy buckthorn and it does the same.
A question from Peggy, does buckthorn blaster work on Asian bittersweet?
Anything with a woody stem.
Yeah, so to clarify, the buckthorn blaster itself as a product is essentially a big bingo dabber. It's just the tool itself, And then that company provides sort of a recipe for glyphosate-based herbicide, but it in principle you can use a different herbicide mix as long as you're following the label.
And the company also sells a dye, which I recommend, because then you know where you've been. And the dye is only about $2.50.
And Sam Schnesky just shared a link to the buckthorn blaster information in the chat box.
Yeah. And sage, just burn them. Sage was asking if what you do with the green knotweed stems.
They explode.
I have not seen that. I actually let them dry for a week or so.
I let them dry for several weeks and then tried to burn them, and then I don't know, I guess because it's like sealed in there, they kind of, maybe it's just, I don't know. I didn't want to be anywhere near the fire. It's funny. Thank you.
Great.
Well, I gotta say, it's really exciting that 95 people are so interested in invasives that they joined this webinar. I think it's great.
No, we're pretty excited too. I think the maybe, Chris, you touched on this earlier, if you have time to stay. Marie mentioned is vinegar just not effective? And it'd be great to hear your opinion or Rachel's on just generally that like kind of DIY approach.
Yeah, I mean, I would say I don't recommend it in the sense that overspray is definitely a possibility. And you're really just hurting those leaves, and you still have bud sites, you still have the remainder of the plant. So it's sort of like the goat method, but less aggressive, I guess. But I generally shy away from these like sort of home recipes. I find either mechanical, like physical tool removal of the plant to be more effective, or using herbicide or cut stump. But just be aware that if you are using vinegar, you are essentially just burning the leaves off of the plant. But otherwise the plant's going to be fine.
And you could also be changing the pH of the soil too. So just be aware of that.
I think some of the recipes call for a lot of salt too, so there's another introduction of stuff you don't want.
Yeah, just to add a comment on our common land, we had a small patch of knotweed, and one industrious neighbor of ours took a whole gallon of vinegar and would pour it right next to this base stem. And she was very persistent about it, did control it, but everything else disappeared from that area as well. So that's my anecdotal information to add to the discussion.
Thanks, Natalie.
Sure. And I have one other comment about the injection method. Someone was asking how effective that was. We have a second home in the Adirondacks in New York, and the highway department in Tupper Lake did a very efficient job of spreading Japanese knotweed about 2.5 miles along the full length of the road. And they owned up to their responsibility and asked for access to the land along the road in order to do the injection method. And they did that for the full length, that 2.5 miles of the road. And there are just 1 or 2 small patches. Otherwise, it's completely gone after 2 years treatment. So
that's good to know.
I thought that was that was my introduction to Japanese knotweed and control. So there they did injection because some of the road drains or is in close proximity to bodies of water. So that was the hesitancy to do spraying of the glyphosate.
Well, great. Any other questions? Thank you so much for joining us this evening. It's great to see there's so much interest in this topic. And I think when the pandemic is behind us, there are a lot of opportunities for this organization to do some in-person, out in the world activities, which I think there'll be a lot of interest in. I'll post the link to the survey one more time if you are interested in providing us with some feedback. That is in the chat box. And thanks for joining us tonight. Everyone have a great night.
Thank you, Corey.
Bye, everyone.
Thanks, everyone. Have a good night.